The airport loudspeaker echoed across a sea of rushing travelers. Julia Palmer tightened her grip on the handbag strap, her breathing quick and shallow as if every step she took carried the weight of unspoken fears. In her arms, her 8-month-old son stirred his small face pressed against her chest, lips parting as if searching for familiar warmth. "Shh, Jamie. Almost there, sweetheart." Her voice trembled, half to soothe him, half to calm herself. She hadn't had much of a choice. When the hospital called to say her mother didn't have much time left, Julia sold whatever she could and even borrowed from her best friend to afford the cheapest ticket back to Chicago. A 10 p.m. flight, the last one of the day. Cramped seats, poor lighting, stale air. But it was her only way home to say goodbye. She never imagined that fate was about to make her meet someone who would change the course of her life. When the boarding gate opened, Julia followed the crowd onto the plane. The fluorescent lights flickered over narrow rows of seats, and the sound of passengers cramming luggage into overhead bins filled the air. She found her seat by the window. Jamie began to cry soft, but in the tight cabin, his voice pierced through every layer of patience around her. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," Julia stammered, fumbling with her bag, searching for the bottle, the pacifier. Anything to make the baby stop crying. A shadow fell over her. A deep, husky voice, cool, measured, used to giving orders, spoke above her head. "The seat next to you, isn't it?" Julia looked up. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair slicked back. A tailored gray suit clung to his frame, quiet authority in every movement. His eyes, dark and stormy, seemed to hold the weight of something unsaid. He didn't smile, just tilted his head slightly enough for the flight attendant to hurry past them. "Oh yes, sorry." "I'll move my things," Julia murmured, shrinking into her seat, clutching Jamie tighter. As he sat down, a faint scent of sandalwood drifted between them, not heavy but warm and disarmingly familiar. She didn't understand why, but sitting beside him made her heart beat unsteady. The plane trembled as it lifted off. Julia closed her eyes, steadying her breath. Jamie was nursing now, half asleep. She finally let her shoulders relax, exhaustion sinking deep into her bones. "First time flying with an infant." The low voice came again, not exactly kind, but not cold either. "Yes, and I think I'm terrible at it," she said with a tired smile. He studied her for a moment. His gaze wasn't pitying. It was curious, deliberate, like she was something that intrigued him. "Children are never the problem," he said quietly. "Adults are." The words were simple, but they made Julia turn toward him. Under the dim cabin lights, his cheekbones caught a soft golden hue. He didn't look at her, just adjusted his shirt cuffs with calm precision. "Do you have kids?" she asked before she could stop herself. Silence. Then his voice lowered. "No. But there was someone who once made me wish I did." Julia didn't know how to respond. Something in his eyes made her chest tighten, as if behind his composure lay a wound that had never truly healed. The hum of the engines lulled her toward sleep. Her eyelids grew heavy. Her head drifted, and when she woke, she realized she'd fallen asleep against his shoulder. "Oh God, I'm so sorry," she gasped, sitting upright, face flushed. "It's fine," he said evenly. "Get some rest. You look like you haven't slept in days." She wanted to protest, but her vision was already blurring. Jamie slept soundly against her chest, his tiny breaths like a lullaby. The warmth of the man beside her, the scent of leather and wood, pulled her into stillness. When Julia woke, the cabin lights had dimmed to the soft amber of pre-landing mode. Jamie was still asleep, and he was in the man's arms. He held the baby gently, one hand supporting the head, the other cradling the hips, rocking with steady rhythm. His dark eyes, as they watched the child, were unexpectedly tender. What are you doing?" Julia gasped, reaching out. He was about to cry. "I was just soothing him," the man replied calmly, handing the baby back. "He sleeps well with me. Maybe because I have the heartbeat of someone who's lost before." The last line made Julia freeze. Lost. Someone. He didn't answer, only adjusted his cuff again, revealing a thin scar, long-healed pale under the light. When the plane landed, Julia felt her heart lurch, not from the jolt of the wheels, but from the strange gravity of the man beside her. He hadn't spoken much, but every glance, every motion carried weight. When she struggled to lift her bag, he stood first, taking her suitcase as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You don't have to hold your baby. I'll take the bag," he said firmly. She stayed quiet, walking beside him down the aisle. The airport lights glowed gold on his features, strong, chiseled like someone from a world ruled not by laws, but by power and blood. "You live in Chicago?" she asked just to fill the silence. "Sometimes." His gaze scanned the crowd, sharp and cautious. "I'm visiting my mother. She's sick." "Cancer," Julia froze. "How did you—" "Just a guess." He tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes reflecting something like recognition or sorrow. People who carry fear the way you do, they're always afraid of losing someone. She couldn't tell whether to be amazed by his perception or unnerved that he could see right through her. At baggage claim, Julia bent to look for her suitcase. For a single second, she turned away, and when she looked back, Jamie was gone. Her heart stopped. Her throat locked. "Jamie." "Where he's here." That same deep voice came from behind her. The man, Henry, was holding her baby suitcase in his other hand. She rushed over, torn between relief and shock. "You can't just—" Someone almost touched him. "The man's gone now," Henry said evenly. "In this airport, you shouldn't trust anyone." Julia looked up, and his eyes were colder now, sharper. In the distance, she caught a glimpse of a man in a dark coat disappearing into the crowd. "You knew him," she whispered. "No, but he knew me." The answer sent a chill through her. Outside, the Chicago night was freezing, her breath turning into smoke. She turned to thank him, but he was already standing by a sleek black car, his face half hidden in the shadows. "Where are you headed?" "My mother's place. About 40 minutes away. I'll grab a taxi. No need." He opened the car door. "Get in." "No, it's late, and that man isn't far." His eyes left no room for argument. Julia hesitated, then climbed in, heart pounding. The door closed, sealing her away from the noise of the airport. Inside, there was only leather sandalwood, and the eerie feeling that she'd just stepped into another world, one far beyond her control. The car rolled through the city. Outside, Chicago's streets passed by like frames of an old film. Julia glanced at the man beside her. His hands rested loosely on his knees, a silver watch catching the flicker of passing lights. He was silent, but she could feel his composure steady, deliberate, unshakable. "What's your name?" she asked softly. A pause. Then his voice. "Henry." That was all. Yet somehow the name etched itself into her mind as if she had heard it before long ago in some half-forgotten dream. When the car stopped on a quiet street, Henry turned to her. "Lock your doors tonight." "Why?" He looked straight into her eyes. "Because ever since you stepped on that flight, I haven't been the only one watching you." Before she could speak, he stepped out, placed her suitcase by the curb, and disappeared into the misty night as if he'd never been there at all. Julia stood frozen. The streetlight cast her shadow and Jamie's into two small, trembling shapes. Inside, her fear tangled with something else, something unexplainable. It felt as though a door had just opened and the world on the other side was waiting for her to walk through. If you believe that a single encounter can change a destiny, stay tuned for the next part, where Julia discovers that the man who drove her home isn't just a businessman, but the ruler of an empire built on sin. Follow the channel so you don't miss part 2, The Man Who Knew Everything. The next morning, Chicago seemed to wake from a long, rain-soaked dream. The air was damp and cold mist blanketing the old brick rooftops. Julia Palmer stood by the window of her mother's small house, wrapped in a worn sweater that hung loosely over her slender frame. In her arms, Jamie stirred softly, his tiny hand reaching for the familiar warmth of her chest. She hadn't slept much. The dream still clung to her, the dim light inside the car, that deep, husky voice, and Henry's final words echoing in her mind. "Lock the doors tonight." When the sun rose, Julia told herself it was nothing, just her imagination. A stranger had helped her, offered a warning, and vanished. Nothing more. Yet what unsettled her most was not what he'd said, but the fact that she believed him. The door creaked open, and a gust of cold wind slipped in. "Julia." A frail, raspy voice called from the next room, "Mom." Mrs. Palmer lay in bed, her skin pale, her eyes sunken, but when she saw her daughter and grandchild, they lit up with sudden life. "You're really here, and this must be my Jamie." Julia laid her son beside her mother and took her hand tightly. The doctor said, "You shouldn't get up," Julia whispered, her throat tight. Her mother smiled faintly. "I know, but there are things doctors don't have to tell you. I just wanted to see the two of you, one last time." The air in the room grew heavy. Julia turned away to hide the tears gathering in her eyes. Jamie babbled something soft, and both women laughed, a fragile laugh, light as breath laced with the salt of despair. By noon, Julia was in the kitchen preparing a meal. When she opened the refrigerator, her heart skipped. It was full eggs, milk meat, even expensive foods she hadn't been able to afford. "Mom, who brought all this?" "Oh, someone delivered it this morning," her mother said weakly. "A polite man. He said he was your friend." Julia froze. "My friend?" "Yes. He left a card." "I think his name was Henry." Julia snatched the card from the table. It was matte black, embossed in silver letters. Henry Sullivan. No address, no title, just a single phone number. Her pulse quickened. She had never told him her name, let alone her address. How had he found her? A chill ran down her spine. That afternoon, while Julia was hanging laundry behind the house, a sleek black car rolled silently to a stop at the gate. No honk, no sound, only a presence that seemed to bend the air around it. The door opened. Henry stepped out. He wore a black shirt, no suit, no tie. Simpler than last night, but somehow even more imposing. "Sorry if I came at a bad time," he said, his voice low, almost courteous. Julia tightened her grip on the laundry line, masking her unease with a strained smile. "You seem to know exactly where I live." "Wasn't hard to find," he replied calmly. "You bought your plane ticket with a credit card linked to your son's birth certificate address." She froze. "You investigated me?" Henry was silent for a moment, then said slowly, "I just needed to be sure you were safe. Last night, someone followed you from the airport. He wasn't just another passenger." Julia's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" He stepped closer just enough for her to catch the faint scent of mint and sandalwood. "There are people who shouldn't know you exist, Julia. But now they do." 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. What are you even saying? I'm no one, just a single mother trying to survive. No one cares about me. Henry studied her for a long moment, then gave a small, humorless smile. No one is truly no one, especially not when they happen to sit beside a man like me. What do you mean? I mean you're unlucky, he said bluntly, almost cruelly. Julia stepped back, her voice trembling. I don't know if you're joking or threatening me. Neither Henry replied, his tone darkening. But if you'd like, I can explain. He walked slowly around the tiny garden, brushing a hand against a blooming pot of daisies. I run businesses, some legitimate others, more complicated. In that world, everyone watches everyone. When someone saw you sitting next to me, they assumed you were connected. Julia's throat tightened. I was just sitting beside you on a plane. That's all. Henry turned his gaze like a deep abyss. I know, but in my world, sometimes that's enough to make you a target. Silence fell. A breeze lifted strands of Julia's hair across her face. Henry reached out and brushed them aside, a simple gesture, yet it made her heart skip. What do you want from me? I want to help you, he said without hesitation. To protect you and your son. Julia laughed bitterly. I don't even know who you are, and now you're telling me I'm being watched, that you want to protect me. This sounds insane. Henry's face didn't change. Crazy or not, you'll believe it soon enough when you realize someone tried your door last night. She froze. The faint clicking sound she'd heard before dawn, she had thought it was just the wind. Her hands tightened around her sweater. Cold dread slithered up her spine. Dusk fell. The sky turned a bruised violet streaked with the fading red of sunlight. Henry stood on the porch, eyes fixed on the quiet street. Do you have any family nearby? He asked. No, just my mother, Jais, and Jamie. Then I'll have someone keep watch from a distance. No, Julia snapped firmer than she meant to. I don't want anything to do with you. Last night I was grateful you helped me, but this... Henry cut in, his voice low but commanding. You think I want to be involved with a stranger? If not for the child, I'd be long gone. The words stunned her. What about Jamie? Henry glanced at the baby playing on the blanket. A flicker of light passed through his eyes, something soft, almost broken. He reminds me of someone I once knew. Those eyes. I can't look away. For a moment, Julia saw a crack in the armor of the man who seemed untouchable. Beneath the calm exterior, there was a wound deep unhealed. Did you lose someone? She asked quietly. Henry didn't answer right away. Then, in a voice so low it was nearly a whisper, my son, 3 years ago. The air froze. Julia looked down at Jamie, then back at Henry. His eyes held no tears, only a hollow stillness that made her chest ache. I'm sorry, she said softly. Don't be. He shook his head. I don't need pity, Julia. I just need to know. This time I won't fail again. The wooden door creaked. Julia's mother coughed from the bedroom. Julia rushed inside, leaving Henry standing alone on the porch. He watched her silhouette fragile yet determined. A faint, unreadable smile tugged at his lips. When Julia returned, he was gone. Only the black business card remained on the table, with a line written beneath it in dark ink. If anything happens, don't call the police. Call me. Night. Julia lay awake, the ticking clock matching her frantic heartbeat. She thought of Henry, his gaze, his words. Something about him terrified her, yet also made her feel protected. Outside, the wind rustled through the bare trees. Jamie slept peacefully in his crib, his breathing soft and steady. Julia got up, checked the windows and the locks, then returned to bed. Just as her eyes began to close, a faint sound came from the back door. Click. Julia shot up, every muscle frozen. She grabbed Jamie, clutching him to her chest. The footsteps outside were slow, deliberate. Then, silence. 1 second. 2. 3. A beam of headlights flashed through the window. A tall figure emerged from the fog, his stride steady, unmistakable. Henry. He opened the door, eyes sweeping the room before settling on Julia and the child in her arms. I told you, he said quietly, his voice calm but chilling. We should never mistake one peaceful night for a peaceful world. In that instant, Julia didn't know whether to feel safe or terrified, because outside lurked danger, but inside that door stood a man who could destroy them both. And still, for reasons she couldn't explain, she couldn't look away. That morning, Chicago was soaked in rain. Droplets clung to the kitchen window, reflecting the flickering yellow lights of the old street outside like faint, trembling memories. Julia stood in the kitchen, her hand shaking slightly as she poured coffee. She hadn't slept all night. Everything that had happened, the noise before dawn, the shadow outside the door, the flash of headlights. And Henry replayed in her mind like a film she couldn't stop. Henry hadn't said much. He'd simply checked every lock, every window frame, and left before sunrise without a goodbye. But when Julia unlocked her phone, she found a message sent at 4:12 a.m. The back door hinge needs replacing. I've sent a repairman this afternoon. Don't open for anyone unless they say my name. No exclamation marks, no emojis, just short, precise sentences. Commands. Julia bit her lip, unsure whether to feel safer or violated. Around noon, a small truck pulled up outside. A middle-aged man carrying a toolbox introduced himself as the repairman sent by Mr. Sullivan. Julia hesitated to open the door, but the man's eyes were kind, and Jamie was sleeping soundly on the couch. Reluctantly, she let him in. He must care about you a lot, the man said as he fitted the new hinge. Julia pretended not to hear. When he left, she noticed a small envelope beside the flower vase. Inside was a neatly folded note written in elegant slanted handwriting. You don't have to trust me, Julia. There are things you don't need to understand. Only survive. H. She gripped the paper tightly, her chest heavy with mixed feelings. Why did he keep appearing in her life, and why her out of millions of people had caught the attention of someone like him? By afternoon, the rain had stopped. Julia pushed Jamie's stroller down the quiet neighborhood street. The air smelled fresh, cool. Golden leaves from the maples carpeted the sidewalk. Every now and then she glanced around. The feeling of being watched never left her. A black car was parked a few houses away. Its tinted windows revealed nothing inside. Julia bit her lip and quickened her pace. It seems you still don't trust me. The deep, husky voice came from behind her, making her heart jolt. Henry stepped out from a narrow alleyway, his long coat dusted with raindrops, dark hair damp against his forehead. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, though relief slipped into her tone despite herself, making sure you don't get into more trouble. "And what if you are the trouble?" she shot back. He paused, his gaze cutting through the mist. "Maybe I am." They walked side by side down the narrow street, their footsteps blending with the slow creak of the stroller wheels. Julia tried to keep her distance, but his presence made that impossible. There was something about Henry, a contradiction between coldness and care, between a man who might have killed and a man who could cradle a child without waking him. "What do you do for a living?" she asked cautiously. He gave a faint smile. "That's a dangerous question. More dangerous than being followed." Henry looked straight ahead, silent for a long moment. Then, quietly, "I run a few businesses. Trade, investments, and other things people prefer not to talk about." "You mean the mafia?" "People like to call it that." He shrugged. "I just call it work." Julia's grip on the stroller tightened. Her blood ran cold. "So where do I fit in your work?" He stopped walking, his eyes locked on hers so intense she forgot to breathe. "You don't. You're not part of any of my work, Julia. You're part of the only thing that reminds me I'm still human." Her heart stumbled in her chest. She wanted to argue, but his voice had a weight that silenced her. Henry leaned closer, brushing her trembling hand. "I know you don't believe me, but I won't let anyone touch you or your son." Those eyes, dark deep, carrying an unspoken promise, left her suspended somewhere between trust and fear. When they returned home, a strange car was parked outside the gate. Two men in suits stood beside it, their eyes sharp as blades. Julia froze, clutching the stroller handle. Henry's expression changed instantly cold, precise. "Go inside," he said softly. His tone wasn't loud, but it left no room for refusal. Julia hurried through the gate with Jamie in her arms. Henry remained outside, facing the men. Their words were too low to hear. She saw only a nod, then one man turned away, speaking into his phone before leaving. When Henry stepped back inside, the rain had started again. Heavy drops drumming against the roof. "My men," he said, as if to reassure her. "But I don't trust all of them." Julia looked at him. "Then who do you trust?" "No one yet. Except..." He stopped mid-sentence. "Except who?" she whispered. "That boy," Henry said, glancing at Jamie. His voice softened. "When he looks at me, I see a part of myself in his eyes." That night, Henry stayed. Julia's mother was weak and she needed help. This time, Julia didn't argue. He sat silently in the living room, the lamplight carving sharp lines across his face, illuminating the faint scar on his wrist. Julia brewed tea and set a cup before him. "You don't have to stay. I don't want to owe you anything." Henry looked at the cup, then up at her. "No one likes to owe a debt. But sometimes that's the only way to survive." She sat across from him. "You keep talking about survival. What exactly did you survive?" He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said quietly, "The day I lost my son, I learned that everything can disappear in a single breath. Since then, I don't let anyone slip out of my control." Julia's throat tightened. His words carried a grief so raw it made her ache. "So now I'm part of your control," she whispered. Henry met her eyes, his gaze burning through the calm like fire beneath ice. "No, Julia. You're part of my survival." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating his face, beautiful, but shadowed like a sculpture cracked by invisible pain. Julia felt something inside her soften. Not out of fear, but from the realization that behind all his power and cruelty, he was just a man still fighting to feel needed again. Near midnight, she awoke to the sound of rain tapping against the window. Henry was still there, sitting in the armchair, half his face bathed in amber light. He hadn't slept. "Don't you ever rest?" she asked softly. "Can't. Rainy nights keep me on edge." Julia glanced outside. The world was thick with darkness. "There's no one out there." "You're wrong," he said, eyes fixed on the window. "Someone's been standing out there. For the past 30 minutes. Her heart leapt. "Are you sure positive?" He stood pulling a small gun from his coat pocket. Julia instinctively stepped back, clutching Jamie. Henry's eyes softened the moment he saw her fear. "Don't be afraid. If I'm right, they won't come closer. But if I'm wrong?" He didn't finish. He only lifted the curtain slightly. A shadow flickered outside, then vanished into the rain. By morning, Henry was gone. On the table sat the cold teacup and a printed photo taken from a street security camera. It showed Julia and Jamie at the airport, slightly blurred but unmistakable. On the back, a single line written in ink. "He knows who you are now." "I'll handle it." Julia's pulse raced. She no longer knew what to believe, only that every time Henry disappeared, the world around her grew unbearably still, as if the storm was merely pausing before it struck again. That afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Julia hesitated, ready to turn anyone away who couldn't say Henry's name. But when she opened it, she froze. A woman stood there wearing a black raincoat, hair tied high, lips a deep crimson. In her gloved hand was an envelope embossed with a silver rose. "Henry Sullivan sent me," the woman said coolly. "He wants to see you tonight. Alone." Julia gripped the doorframe, feeling the cold crawl up her fingers. The woman bowed, slightly placed the envelope on the step, and walked away. Inside the letter was a single line written in black ink, precise and sharp as a blade. "If you want to know why you can't walk away from me, come." Outside, the rain began again, and in its relentless rhythm, Julia realized the door she once tried to close had been open ever since the moment she boarded that plane. Rain had fallen over Chicago all day, and by nightfall, the streets glimmered under neon reflections, blue and violet streaks that rippled across puddles like fragments of blurred memory. Julia Palmer wrapped herself in a long coat, clutching the sealed letter in her hand. Her chest felt heavy, as if she were walking toward a place she already knew once she entered there would be no way back. She left her son with Mrs. Palmer, repeating again and again that she wouldn't be long. "Julia, it's pouring out there." "Where are you going?" her mother asked anxiously. "I'm just meeting someone, Mom. I'll be back soon." "That someone... Is it the man from last night?" Julia paused, then nodded slightly. Her mother's eyes darkened with sorrow and fear. "Be careful, sweetheart. There are people that once you step into their world, you no longer have the right to choose." The address on the letter led her to a tall glass building in the heart of downtown. Its rain-streaked windows shimmered under the city lights. No nameplate, no sign. The doorman gave her a brief look before murmuring, "Mr. Sullivan is expecting you." The elevator rose in perfect silence. When the doors opened, she found herself in a dimly lit room. The only light came from the golden flicker of candles arranged on a long dining table. Henry stood at the far end, tall, dressed in black, a glass of red wine in hand. There was nothing romantic about him. He didn't look like a man hosting a dinner, but rather one issuing a summons. "You came." His voice was low, smooth, almost like a whisper brushing past her ear. Julia stepped forward, her footsteps echoing faintly in the wide, still space. "You told me to come," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Now tell me, why can't I walk away from you?" Henry set his glass down. His gaze drifted slowly from her face to her clenched hands. "You think I'm the one binding you," he said quietly. "Julia, you were bound long before I ever touched your life." He drew a thin folder from his jacket and placed it on the table. On the cover, Palmer Evelyn, her mother's name. Julia froze. "That's my mother. Why do you have her file? She once worked for a medical company that was connected to an investment fund in New York. That fund belonged to me." His voice was calm, deliberate. Julia stared at him. "What are you saying? She wasn't just an employee? She once saved my father's life." The air between them turned still heavy. Henry took a step closer, his tone soft yet weighted with truth. "In 1988, my father was shot during a purge. Your mother, then just a trainee nurse, kept him alive on the operating table. Afterward, she was relocated, given a new identity, and moved to Chicago. I searched for her for years, but I never found her. Not until I met you on that flight." Julia's eyes widened, disbelief and fear mixing in her voice. "You're lying. Do you really think I'd need to lie to you?" Henry replied, his gaze unwavering. Tears stung her eyes. "Why were you watching me? Why didn't you just tell me from the start?" "Because I wasn't sure who you were," he said. "And I wasn't sure what I'd do if I actually found her or her daughter." Silence filled the room. Outside, rain beat against the glass like a second heartbeat. Henry refilled the glasses and gestured for her to sit. "Julia, there's more you need to know, but I don't want you to be afraid. I don't want to be the reason you run." She sat down, her eyes never leaving him. "I don't understand what you want, gratitude control." He gave a tired smile, one that seemed to dissolve in the candlelight. "Maybe both, but more than anything, I want to understand why when I saw you holding that child on the plane, I felt like I'd found something I lost a long time ago." His voice lowered rough around the edges. "Not love at first sight, Julia. Fear of losing something before I could even name it." Julia held the wineglass tightly, staring at his face through the soft flame's glow. There was something about him, something that drew people in, even as it warned them away. He was like fire in winter, dangerous to touch, unbearable to live without. "You know I have a child," she said quietly. "You know everything. But do you know the only thing I want is peace? Peace doesn't exist in my world," Henry murmured. "But I can give you something close to it. And the cost that you let me protect you whether you want it or not." A gust of wind rattled the window. The candlelight flickered. Julia shivered. Henry stepped closer and took her hand. "They've found your address, Julia. The woman who brought you that letter today, she wasn't mine." Julia's eyes widened. "What? You've been watched. Another organization rivals of mine think you're a weakness they can use." Her breath caught. "You mean I'm in danger?" "Not in. You already are." He released her hand, pulled out his phone, and spoke a few sharp sentences in Italian. His tone changed colder absolute. The softness of a man vanished, replaced by the predator that ruled his world. 10 minutes later, a young man entered, moving quickly. "Boss, they've left the area." The car went north. Henry nodded. The man bowed slightly and disappeared. Julia gripped the edge of the table. "What have you dragged me into?" "Henry." He met her gaze, his voice calm but certain. "You didn't do anything. I'm the one who dragged you in. And I'll be the one to pull you out." "Pull me out?" "How with money guns, or that power you seem to worship with all of it?" he said simply. She wanted to be angry to tell him she didn't need saving. But when he bent to pick up the fallen envelope, and she saw his hand trembling slightly, she realized the truth. Beneath all that iron and authority was a man still haunted by guilt. "You can't save everyone, Henry," she said softly but firmly. "And you can't turn me into something that fixes your past." He looked at her for a long time, his eyes dark as the night skyline behind him. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly. "But I once lost someone I loved more than life itself. I won't let it happen again, even if the next person doesn't belong to me." They sat in silence for a long time. Outside, the rain eased, leaving only the faint hum of the city night. Julia rose to leave. "I'll take you home," Henry offered. She didn't answer, just turned away. But when his hand touched her shoulder, she stopped. "Julia," he said softly, "if anyone shows up near your house tonight, don't be afraid. They're mine." Their eyes met a brief moment that was both warning and reassurance. When Julia stepped out of the building, the night wind cut through her coat, but her heart felt colder still. The fragments of the story her mother, his father, the saving, the killing were slowly forming a picture she didn't want to see. She understood one thing: Henry hadn't come to harm her. But he was not the kind of man who could simply leave. He was the kind of man who, once he entered someone's life, would never truly leave it, like the scent of sandalwood, warm, intoxicating, and impossible to wash away. That night when Julia returned home, her mother was asleep, and Jamie was breathing softly in his crib. But something felt off the curtains, half-drawn, the faint sound of rain against the glass. Through the window, a figure stood near the fence. She didn't need to look twice. She knew who it was. Henry. He stood motionless under the rain, no umbrella, his eyes fixed on her window. Julia slowly drew the curtain closed, her heartbeat quickening. She knew from this night onward, every line between them had blurred between emotion and fear. Freedom and protection, a woman who wanted peace, and a man born to destroy it. Chicago in early December was so cold that even breath seemed to freeze midair. Snow hadn't fallen yet, but the damp chill made everything feel brittle, even the parts of Julia Palmer's heart she thought had long gone numb. Since that night, Henry's presence had lingered around her, quiet, steady, and undeniable. No warnings, no announcements, just the faint trace of someone watching over her. When she went to the market, a stranger carried her heavy bags and vanished. When she took Jamie to the clinic, the bill was already paid. Each morning, the gate was oiled, the locks replaced. No one said a word, but Julia knew. It was him. That morning, she woke to a gentle knock at the window. Pulling the curtain aside, she saw Henry standing under the porch, dressed in a black coat. Raindrops scattered across his shoulders. The sight made her heart tremble, not from surprise, but from something else, a quiet, inexplicable feeling that he wasn't there to intrude, but to fill a space she'd long learned to live without. She opened the door. "What are you doing here?" she asked softly, her tone gentler than usual. "Taking you somewhere." "Where? Somewhere you need to be." The black car stopped before a cemetery on a hill. The sky hung low and gray, the wind cutting through bare trees. Julia stepped out, clutching her coat tight. Henry walked beside her, tall, silent, a presence that drew attention without effort. They stopped before a fresh grave. The name Evelyn Palmer gleamed faintly on the stone. The flowers were already wilted from frost. "You..." Julia's voice cracked. "How did you know my mother passed away?" Henry bowed his head, his voice as low and distant as the rain. "I had someone watching the hospital. They called me when it happened. I didn't want you to hear it alone." Julia's throat tightened. She couldn't tell if she was furious or grateful. In that moment, she realized how thin the line was between compassion and control. Line Henry seemed to walk without effort. "You think I needed you here?" she cried, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You don't understand Henry. My mother, she was the last piece of my normal life. Now she's gone, and you're standing here as if you have the right to replace her." Henry said nothing, letting her words cut through the silence. When she turned to leave, his voice broke softly behind her. "I don't want to replace anyone. I just don't want you to lose anything else." She stopped. For the first time, Julia saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before: fear. Not the kind of fear that comes from danger, but the deeply human fear of losing control over one's own heart. "Have you ever thought," she whispered, "that you're the reason I can't find peace? Yes. And you still keep doing this. Because sometimes, Julia, you have to give up peace to stay alive." They left the cemetery in silence. On the drive back, Henry didn't speak. The car filled with the sound of a quiet piano piece, slow, melancholic. Every note stretching between them like fog. When they arrived, Julia didn't get out right away. She stood beside the car looking at him. "Aren't you tired of controlling everything?" she asked. He turned the streetlight, catching the edge of his profile. "Of course I'm tired. But if I stop, people die. I learned that the cruel way." She hesitated, then asked softly, "Your son?" Henry's gaze drifted toward the distance, his breath forming white clouds in the cold air. He was like Jamie, bright eyes, always laughing, and he believed his father was a good man. His voice faltered. "Then one day, because of a single misplaced bullet, I lost him. And with him the belief that I could ever do anything right again." The wind blew, carrying the scent of wood and faint smoke from his coat. Julia couldn't stop herself from placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "You can't live in the past forever, Henry. I don't know any other way." The quiet confession broke something inside her. Standing in the misty Chicago night, Julia realized that the man before her, the so-called ruler of shadows, was just a lost soul searching for a reason to believe he could still be saved. Days passed. Henry vanished again, as he always did. But this time, Julia wasn't afraid. Instead, she felt something emptier, the strange stillness of missing a presence she hadn't meant to depend on. She tried to return to routine caring for Jamie, cooking, working, but every time she saw a tall silhouette on a distant street, her heart stumbled. On the third night after Henry's disappearance, an envelope slid through the door. No return address. Inside was a photograph of her and Jamie taken at the park that morning. On the back, a single message scrawled in blue ink. "He can't protect you forever." Her blood turned cold. She picked up the phone, hands trembling. 1 ring. 2. Then his voice low, rough, calm in a way that scared her more than panic ever could. "I assume you've seen it." "Who took that picture?" she gasped. "Someone I once trusted. And now he wants to use you to make me kneel." His tone darkened like thunder gathering before a storm. "I'm on my way. Lock the doors. Don't open for anyone." 30 minutes later, an engine roared outside. Henry entered, bringing with him the cold and a faint trace of gunpowder. He moved through the house with practiced precision, checking every corner. Julia still trembled, but the moment she saw him, her fear shifted into something else almost. Relief. He took her hand gently. "I'm sorry. You shouldn't have been caught in this. What is this, a war I thought I could control?" "You can't control everything, Henry." "No," he said quietly, "but I can protect you." She looked at him. In the soft golden light, his eyes carried something fierce and fragile, like a man who'd staked everything on believing that at least one thing in his world could still be pure. "Henry," she whispered, "if you truly want to protect me, stop. Don't drag me any further into your darkness." He smiled faintly, a smile both aching and tender. "Julia, sometimes people don't get to choose the light. They only get to choose who they hold on to in the dark." She wanted to reply, but he had already turned away. His voice was low, almost to himself. "They'll come soon, and this time I won't let anyone touch you." The words hung in the small house, and Julia realized that whether she wanted to or not, the line between being saved and being trapped was already blurring. Outside, the rain began again. Henry stood alone under the porch, his shadow stretched long beneath the dim light. Through the window, Julia watched him tilt his head up, letting the rain hit his face as if punishing himself with the cold. After a long silence, he turned back, his gaze gentler now. "Julia," he said. His voice steady, deep, "if anything happens. Believe that I never meant to hurt you." Tears slipped silently down her cheeks. "But you already are, Henry," she whispered. "Just in a way you don't see." That night when he left, Julia stayed by the window long after his car disappeared into the mist. She knew he would return not out of duty, but because of a promise neither of them had spoken aloud. A promise born beneath the rain between two souls, wandering in a world where love and danger were the same thing. On the 3rd night after the heavy rain, Chicago lay beneath a thin veil of mist. The trees glistened with water beneath the streetlights, and somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed long and low, carrying with it the melancholy of a city that refused to sleep. Julia Palmer sat beside the bed, watching her son sleep. Jamie's breathing was even, his small hands curled gently over his chest, his face peaceful, untouched by the very idea of fear. She brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, her heart tightening with a vague unease. Since Henry's return, everything around her had changed. The silence wasn't the comforting kind. It was too still, too heavy. The kind that comes right before a storm. She knew something was coming, and this time it wouldn't be just a shadow beyond the fence. Close to midnight, there was a knock at the door. 3 times, short, precise. Julia froze, her heartbeat racing. She peered through the curtain. Henry. He stood under the rain wearing a dark shirt and a soaked leather jacket. His face looked gaunter than before, and a thin cut along his cheek still bled faintly. When she opened the door, he stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over her before resting on the sleeping child. "You're hurt," Julia gasped. "I'm fine." He shrugged off his jacket, revealing a long gash across his arm. "Just an unpleasant meeting." "Fine," she snapped, running to grab the first aid kit. "You think getting shot is nothing." "What are you doing, Henry?" "Trying to prove you're immortal." Henry said nothing. He sat quietly on the chair, letting her clean the wound. The yellow lamplight flickered over his face, deepening the shadows in his dark eyes. Julia realized her hands were trembling. Every time the gauze touched his skin, her heart clenched, not from fear, but from something dangerously close to care. "Who did this?" she whispered. "Who hurt you, an old acquaintance?" "How old?" He met her gaze. "Old enough to have once saved my life and then sold it." She stopped mid-motion, staring at him. "Because of me," Henry didn't answer. But the truth was already in his eyes, a mix of pain and resolve. "Not just because of you," he said slowly. "Because I let them see my weakness. And in my world, that's unforgivable." Julia's voice trembled. "And that weakness is me." "No," he said quietly, his tone softening. "It's what I feel for you." The air thickened, pressing around them. Only the clock's ticking filled the space between breaths. Julia lowered her eyes and began to wrap the bandage again. Each brush of fabric against his skin seemed to close the distance between them, blurring every line that had once separated fear from something far more fragile. Henry's gaze softened. "You know, Julia, when you get angry, you don't look like someone who hates me. You look like someone who's afraid." She looked up, eyes shimmering. "Do you know what I'm afraid of, Henry? I'm afraid of myself. Of the way I can't hate you even though I should." A faint smile touched his lips, the kind that came and went like a ghost. "That," he said quietly, "is the most dangerous thing you could ever say to a man like me." "Why?" "Because I'll believe it." They fell silent. Outside, thunder rumbled far away. A flash of lightning lit up the room. Catching the moment, his hand closed gently around her wrist, firm enough to still her breath. "Julia," he said slowly, "I've seen so many people try to leave me. None of them succeeded. But you're different. If you want to go, I'll let you. Just this once." Her voice was barely a whisper. "And if I don't, then you'll stay in my world where every promise is kept with blood." That night, Henry didn't leave. He sat in the living room, gun on the table, eyes fixed on the window. Julia lay on the couch across from him, wrapped in a thin blanket, unable to sleep. The rain grew heavier, beating softly on the roof. "You can't live like this forever." "Henry," she murmured. "I don't live, Julia," he said without turning. "I just survive. And me." He finally looked at her, his voice gentler. "You're the only thing that makes me feel alive." Near dawn, the rain eased. Henry rose, his expression tense. "Something's wrong." He stepped onto the porch, scanning the alley behind the house. Julia followed, her heart pounding. A black car was parked in the distance, its headlights off. Henry's grip tightened on the gun. "Get inside." "No. You. Inside now." His voice cut through the night like steel. Julia clutched Jamie and ran to the bedroom, her pulse racing. Then gunfire. 1 shot, 2, 3, the sound of shattering glass, tires screeching, then silence. When she emerged, Henry was standing in the yard shirt soaked in blood, his face set and cold again. "Are you hurt?" she cried, running to him. "No, but they've sent a message. The kind of men you should forget the names of. You and the boy have to leave." Julia froze. "Leave where? Anywhere but Chicago. I have a house in Maine, quiet near the coast. I'll take you there at sunrise. I can't just run away like a criminal, Henry. I have a life I have." "That life is over, Julia." His tone was sharp, final, cutting through her words. "The moment you boarded that plane with me, everything changed." Tears welled up as she whispered, "Why me?" Henry stepped closer, his voice softening. His fingers lifted her chin gently. "Because you're not like anyone in my world. Because when you look at me, you see a man, not a monster." "But you're both," she said quietly. Maybe he admitted with a sad smile. "And you're the only one who's ever made the monster want to forget himself." As dawn crept through the window, pale light filled the room, revealing 2 exhausted faces. Henry placed a small golden key in her palm. "What's this?" "The house in Maine. Keep it. If anything happens to me, go. Don't look back." Her hand shook as she held the key. "You think I'd leave you?" He smiled faintly. "I hope you do. Because if you stay, you'll die with me." Before leaving, he leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead, a brief kiss that made the whole world fall silent. "Thank you," he murmured, voice rough and low, "for letting me be close. Even for a little while." Julia couldn't speak. She only reached for the wound on his arm, the one that hadn't yet healed much, like whatever fragile bond they shared. When the door closed behind him, she stood there for a long time, listening to the fading sound of the engine through the mist. Part of her wanted to run after him. Another part feared that if she did, she'd lose herself forever. On the table, the golden key lay still small, shining faintly in the early light. Julia touched it gently and whispered, "You can go, Henry, but you've left something behind in me that no one will ever take away." Outside, the sky brightened, and the first snowflakes began to fall soft, as promises cold as truth, fragile as new beginnings. Julia knew this peace would not last, because in Henry Sullivan's world, peace was only ever borrowed, never kept. 3 weeks had passed since Henry left Chicago. Every morning, Julia Palmer still made coffee, still fed Jamie breakfast, still walked the quiet streets of the small town where she now lived. Everything seemed normal again. But she knew peace was a surface illusion, a calm lake waiting for the next stone to break it. The golden key Henry had left her remained in the drawer by her bed, cold, heavy like a piece of memory she couldn't throw away. Sometimes after Jamie fell asleep, she would take it out, hold it in her palm, and let the cold metal touch her skin, just to remind herself it had all truly happened. Not a dream. Not a delusion. One morning, as Julia was feeding Jamie, there was a knock at the door. 3 times. Short, distinct. Her heart skipped. She walked to the door and cracked it open. But it wasn't Henry. It was a woman in her 40s, hair tied neatly, brown eyes sharp yet kind. She wore a long coat and carried a calm, almost sorrowful air. "Ms. Palmer," the woman asked. "I'm Nora Bennett, an old friend of Henry Sullivan's." Julia froze. "Did he send you?" Nora shook her head. "No. If Henry knew I was here, he'd be furious. But you need to hear this." They sat in the small kitchen. Nora handed her a thick envelope. Inside were several photographs and a handwritten note. The note contained only a few lines. The writing strong, deliberate. "If I don't return, don't look for me. But if someone comes for you, remember, they're only telling half the truth. H.S." Julia looked up, her voice unsteady. "What does this mean?" Nora exhaled slowly. "Henry's in New York, but not for business, not the kind he told you. There's a man named Vincent Morano, an old rival, and he's back. This time, Henry isn't the one holding control." "Vincent," Julia repeated softly. "The one who hurt him." "No," Nora said grimly. "Worse. Vincent was once the man Henry called brother." Nora glanced around the small house, lowering her voice. "Do you know much about Henry's past?" Julia shook her head. "Only fragments. He said his father was powerful, but he never talked about it." "Powerful is an understatement." Nora gave a faint, bitter smile. "Henry was born into a world where death is the only proof of loyalty. He lost his only son in a purge one Vincent orchestrated. And now that man has returned to take the only thing Henry has left." Julia's chest tightened. "Me, you and your son," Nora said gently, placing a hand on the table. "Henry knew you'd become a target. That's why he sent you away. But you stayed and they're getting closer." That night, Julia couldn't sleep. Wind howled softly through the window, its whistle like a distant calling. Jamie stirred in his sleep, murmuring unintelligibly. She held him close, her heart heavy with fear and longing. Where was Henry now? Was he alive? And if he was fighting, was it for pride? Or for her? She remembered their last morning together, the golden key, the look in his eyes. "Don't come back," he'd said. But the more she tried to obey, the stronger the pull to return. 2 days later, Nora returned. "We have to leave," she said firmly. "They've traced you." Julia nodded, panic rising. She gathered only what she needed and held Jamie tightly as they left. Before closing the door, she took one last look around. The house seemed to hold echoes, traces of Henry's presence, of moments too fragile to last, yet impossible to forget. They left Chicago in an old gray car heading east. Nora drove with focused intensity, eyes never leaving the road. "Where are we going?" Julia asked quietly. "Maine," Nora replied. "The place Henry wanted you to reach. I have people there. It's safer." As the miles passed, Jamie slept in her arms. Outside the window, bare trees and faded streetlights slipped by every mile, shedding another layer of her old life. "Do you love him?" Nora asked suddenly, eyes still fixed on the road. Julia hesitated. "You don't have to answer," Nora continued. "I loved him once. A long time ago." Julia turned to her startled. "Don't misunderstand," Nora said softly, almost smiling. "I loved him knowing I could never have him. Henry doesn't belong to anyone. But if he's chosen you, it means you made him believe there's still something worth coming back to." Tears filled Julia's eyes. "He never made me any promises." "Henry doesn't promise," Nora replied. "He acts." By the time they reached Maine, night had fallen. The house stood by the coast, isolated and facing the gray-blue sea. The air smelled of salt and old wood. Julia opened the door. Inside, everything was ready food in the kitchen, clean sheets, logs stacked by the fireplace. "He prepared all of this," Julia whispered. Nora nodded. "Henry never leaves anything to chance." That night, Julia tucked Jamie into a small bed by the window. The boy's cheeks were rosy from the cold air. She sat by the window, staring at the moonlight shimmering across the restless sea fragments of silver, like broken glass. Around midnight, Nora entered quietly and placed another envelope on the table. "I just received word from New York," she said, her voice low. "Henry's being hunted." Julia's breath caught. "He's alive for now, but Vincent captured one of his closest men. Henry won't be able to stay hidden much longer. We have to help him." "No, Julia." Nora's hand gripped her shoulder. "Henry doesn't need saving. He needs you safe. That's the only way he can fight without breaking." Julia stepped out onto the balcony. The ocean wind whipped through her hair, freezing her skin. She thought of him, Henry, his blood-stained shirt, the proud but wounded look in his eyes. She closed her eyes, listening to the waves crash against the rocks. In the wind's howl, she could almost hear his voice. "If something happens, don't look for me." But how could she not look for him when her heart was still tethered to wherever he stood, bleeding, fighting, surviving? The next morning, Julia woke to find Nora gone. On the table lay a short note. "Don't leave the house. Someone's on their way. Trust him, but trust no one else." Julia folded the note, unease rising in her chest. By noon, the sound of an engine echoed from the road. A black SUV pulled up to the gate. The door opened. A tall man stepped out. Dark hair, weary eyes, a familiar stance. Julia's heart stopped. Henry? He stood there exhausted, his face hardened by sleepless nights, yet his eyes still alive, fierce and bright. As she rushed to him, he spoke softly, only 2 words inside. "Now." She wanted to ask questions, but when she saw the dried blood on his hand, she knew not now. Once the door closed, Henry leaned against the wall, catching his breath. "You're hurt," Julia whispered. "Nothing serious." He scanned the room quickly. "Where's Nora?" "She left. Said you'd be coming." Henry nodded. "Good." Then his expression darkened. "You shouldn't have been here alone. Vincent knows about this place." Julia froze. "What do you mean, there's been a leak? Someone betrayed us. This house isn't safe anymore. Then where will we go?" He reached for the gun at his side, his voice low, decisive. "Nowhere. It's time to end this." She stared at him. "End what? The story between me and him." Henry stepped closer, his hand lifting to her cheek. "Julia, if I don't come back, take Jamie and leave the country. There's a safe hidden under the floor passports cache." "You'll know what to do," Julia shook her head, tears streaming. "No, you can't leave me again." He leaned down, pressing his lips gently to her forehead. "I have to, Julia. For you. For him. For myself." He turned to go. The door swung open, and the sea wind rushed in wild cold, carrying the scent of salt and danger. His coat billowed as he stepped into the storm. Julia stood frozen, watching his figure fade over the dunes, the ache inside her spreading like frost. It felt as if the world had just taken half her soul away. And then, carried by the wind, came his voice, faint but clear. "If the wind blows east, it means I'm still alive." Julia clutched the golden key in her hand and fell to her knees, tears mixing with the ocean wind. Because sometimes love isn't meant to keep someone close. It exists to keep them alive, even from afar. New York. 1 week later, the city that never slept seemed eerily still tonight. The kind of silence that felt deliberate, as if the sky itself was holding its breath before something inevitable. Henry Sullivan stepped out of the black car. His dark coat was dusted with grime, the faint scent of gunpowder still clinging to his hands. Under the streetlights, his face was drawn tense and unreadable cold enough that even passers-by instinctively kept their distance. He hadn't slept in 3 days. Not from fear, but because every time he closed his eyes, she appeared. And that was something he couldn't bear right now. In front of him stood an abandoned building. Inside waited Vincent Morano, once a brother, now an enemy. And tonight, only one of them would walk out alive. Meanwhile, in Maine, Julia Palmer woke to the sound of thunder rolling over the sea. The house was silent. Jamie slept soundly, but the wind rattled the windows with a nervous urgency. Julia sat up, a chill running through her. Her phone lit up on the bedside table, one message from an unknown number. If he doesn't return, leave. Tonight. Her heart thudded in her chest. Henry. Where was he? And why did every message about him feel like a farewell? She stepped out onto the balcony. The ocean crashed against the rocks, waves foaming white under the storm. The air carried salt and faintly the smell of gunpowder. The scent that only ever belonged to one man. New York, 1:00 a.m. Henry stood in the dark inside what had once been his office years ago. The walls still bore bullet holes, and on the desk sat an unopened bottle of whiskey. Henry Sullivan, came a voice from the shadows, smooth, taunting. Vincent stepped into the dim light holding a silver gun, a smirk tugging at his lips. So you finally showed up. I was beginning to think you were dead. Henry didn't answer. He just looked at him, not with hatred, but with something colder, heavier. Recognition of a memory turned poison. You shouldn't have come back, Vincent said. You should have stayed far away with her. Don't say her name. Henry's voice was quiet, but it cut like steel. Vincent chuckled. Julia Palmer, bright eyes like your late wife's. The kind of woman who makes men lose their minds and their lives. A gunshot split the air. Then another. Glass shattered. Dust exploded from the walls. Henry dove behind a column, blood seeping through his sleeve. Vincent's laughter echoed across the empty floor. You know what I've always admired about you, Henry, he called out. You never learned how to surrender. Henry reloaded, voice hoarse but steady. That's because you never lost anything worth surviving for. Back in Maine, Julia couldn't sit still. She placed Jamie in the car seat, grabbed her coat, and drove off into the storm, heading for the nearest phone booth. The coastal road was slick with rain. Henry, where are you? She whispered as though he could hear. When she reached the booth, she dialed the number he'd once left her. A man's voice, unfamiliar, answered. Julia Palmer. Yes, I need to speak to Henry Sullivan. A pause. Then the man said, If you truly care for him, don't let anyone see you tonight. Where is he? She demanded. New York. But if you go there, you'll both die. The line went dead. Julia stood in the downpour, the rain washing her tears into the sea. New York. The air inside the building was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder. Vincent clutched his bleeding arm, but still grinned. You've grown weak, Henry. You're not the wolf I used to know. Henry rose slowly, blood running down from his shoulder. His face was pale, but his eyes calm, terrifyingly calm. Maybe he said quietly, Because I finally found something worth being afraid to lose. Vincent faltered, the smirk fading. She changed you. No, Henry said. She reminded me who I used to be. Vincent raised his gun again. Then that's a shame. Another shot rang out. Smoke filled the room. Then silence. Maine. 3:00 a.m. Julia hadn't gone back. She sat in the car by the roadside, gripping the steering wheel, torn between fear and longing. One voice told her to run to protect her child. The other told her to go to find him, no matter the cost. She remembered his last words to her. If the wind blows east, believe I'm still alive. She looked toward the sea. The wind was shifting, turning east. New York. Dawn. The first light of day spilled through shattered glass, casting long shadows across the floor. 2 bodies lay in the room, one motionless, eyes open in disbelief. Vincent. The silver gun rested beside his hand. Henry stood nearby, slumped against the wall, blood soaking through his shirt. He'd won, but victory felt hollow, the price far too high. As he staggered out of the building, pain seared through his chest, but a strange peace settled over him. Then his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown sender. "She's looking for you. Stop her if you still can." Henry exhaled a shaky laugh. "Julia," he murmured. On the highway heading south, Julia drove through the fog. She didn't know exactly where he was, only that she couldn't stay still any longer. Then headlights flared behind her. A black SUV. It drew closer faster. Julia's pulse spiked. She turned sharply, but the SUV followed. A gunshot cracked the air. The tire burst. Her car spun wildly, veering off the road down the sandy embankment. A scream, the crash, then silence. When Julia opened her eyes, her head throbbed. Jamie was crying, but unharmed. She pulled him close, blood dripping down her temple. Above, heavy footsteps approached. "Ms. Palmer." The voice was low, male unfamiliar. A tall man in a black coat emerged from the fog. "Henry Sullivan sent me," he said. "He needs you. Now." Julia stared, torn between suspicion and hope, until she noticed the silver chain around his neck. Henry's chain. Her breath caught. At that same moment in New York, Henry collapsed against the wall, blood pooling beneath him. In his trembling hand, his phone screen flickered, showing a live feed of Julia holding Jamie being pulled from the wreckage by the man wearing his chain. A faint smile touched his lips. "She's alive," he whispered. Outside, sirens wailed. Red and blue lights flashed across the walls. Henry lifted his gaze to the sunrise pouring through the broken window. For an instant, he saw her not with his eyes, but with everything left inside him that could still feel. Maine. The next morning, Julia woke in the old coastal house, a bandage around her head. The stranger was gone. Only a note remained on the table. "He's alive, but not safe. Wait for word and don't leave." Julia clutched the note, her heart pounding. The wind swept through the window, sharp, salty cold. "Henry," she whispered, voice trembling yet steady. "Wherever you are, live. For me, for Jamie." Outside, a lone bird crossed the gray morning sky, gliding east. The wind shifted with it, and somewhere between two gunfires, between love and survival, hope was still breathing. Maine, 3 weeks after the crash. Morning mist covered the coast like a thin veil, hiding the horizon from sight. The waves came and went in steady rhythm, the slow breathing of something both wounded and at peace. Julia Palmer sat by the window, a wool shawl draped loosely over her shoulders, a cup of cold tea in her hands. Her body had begun to heal, but her mind hadn't. Every night she woke in the middle of an unfinished dream, one where Henry turned away and walked into the dark, leaving only the wind to carry his voice away. The last message she'd received from an unknown number read simply, "He's alive, but he can't come back. Not yet." Just one word yet, but it was enough to keep her holding on. She began writing letters to him. Never sent, just written. They piled up inside a small wooden box in her desk drawer. Every letter began the same way, Henry. If you're still somewhere in this world, read this with your heart. In those letters, she told him about Jamie, how the boy still looked toward the door whenever a car passed. How he whispered, "Daddy," whenever he saw a man walking down the street. She wrote about Maine, about the salty wind, the silver moonlight on sleepless nights, and the kind of loneliness that couldn't be silenced no matter how hard she tried. One late afternoon, Julia walked down to the shore. The sky was leaden, the waves struck hard against the rocks. She dropped one of the letters into the water. The paper swirled, twisted in the current, and vanished, as if carrying away all the words she never dared to speak aloud. Then she heard footsteps on the gravel behind her. Julia turned. A man in a dark coat and hat stood in the fog, his face hidden by shadow. "Ms. Palmer." His voice was rough, low, and cold. "Who are you?" Julia stepped back, cautious. "I work for Henry Sullivan." Her breath caught. He's alive." The man nodded slightly. "But he can't stay here. He's being hunted. There's a traitor inside his ranks, and Vincent isn't dead as everyone believed." Julia froze. "What did you say, Vincent? Is alive?" "Badly wounded," the man said, "but he escaped. And now he's after the only thing Henry still cares about." "Me? You?" he confirmed, a flicker of sympathy in his eyes. "Henry knows you won't hide forever. That's why he sent me to get you out before Vincent finds you." Julia turned toward the sea, the wind whipping her hair across her face. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not leaving." "You don't understand," the man urged. "If you stay, he'll come for you, and if he comes for you, he'll walk straight into a trap. This time, he won't make it out." That night, Julia didn't sleep. She sat by candlelight reading through every letter she'd written, but never sent. Each trembling line felt like half a conversation with the wind. She knew Henry knew he would return, even if it meant stepping straight into hell. He always had been that kind of man, willing to walk through fire just to keep someone else standing in the light. And Julia realized if she wanted him to live, she had to be the one to leave. The next morning, Julia rose early. She packed a few belongings and placed the letters into the wooden box. On the table, she left a single note, Henry. "I don't know where you are, but if you come back, know that I didn't leave out of fear. I left because I believe you'll find your way home." She lifted Jamie into the car and drove north. The road wound through fog and forest, but her heart for the first time felt strangely calm. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of New York, Henry Sullivan emerged from an underground hideout. His shoulder was still bandaged, his movements stiff, but his eyes, sharp as steel, had lost all hesitation. An older man with gray hair approached him. "Vincent made contact," he said quietly. "He wants to meet." "Where, Pier 27? "The old docks." Henry nodded. "Good." He reached into his pocket and unfolded a crumpled piece of paper. The ink faded the edges. "Water-stained. If the wind blows east, I'll be waiting." He tucked it close to his chest. "Get the car ready," he said. "Tonight it ends." Night, Pier 27. The harbor was empty, silent, except for the wind and the low moan of the tide. Rusting containers towered in the dark. The air reeked of salt and oil. Henry walked forward, each step echoing on the metal floor. In the distance, Vincent waited, leaning on a wooden cane, his pale face marked by half-healed scars. "You came?" Vincent rasped. "I figured you wouldn't be able to stay away, not while she's still out there." Henry said nothing. Vincent smirked. "She's made you weak, Henry. She'll be the death of you." "Maybe," Henry said softly, drawing his gun. "But she made me alive before that." Gunfire split the night. The ocean roared. Flashes of light tore through the darkness, then silence. When it was over, only one man stood. Henry staggered out of the warehouse, blood streaking his arm. Behind him, Vincent lay still, eyes open toward the sky, lifeless. Henry looked down at him, expression hollow, but calm. "It's over," he whispered. "No one has to run anymore." The next morning, Maine. Julia drove into a small town near the Canadian border. She stopped at a roadside cafe and called Nora. No answer. She turned on the radio to fill the silence. Breaking news: an explosion occurred late last night at Pier 27, New York. Police have confirmed 2 men were found at the scene. One dead, the other missing, presumed fallen into the sea. Identities remain undisclosed. The cup slipped from Julia's hand, shattering. Jamie started crying, but she didn't hear. That evening, Julia returned to the Maine coastline. The air was cold, the sky heavy, the waves wild. She walked barefoot across the wet sand, the wooden box in her hands. "Henry," she whispered, "if you can hear me, come back." She opened the box. The wind rose, scattering the letters into the sky. Sheets of paper danced like white birds carried out over the dark water until they disappeared into the mist. One drifted low, hovering above the waves. And in that moment, Julia saw him. Far away on the eastern rocks stood a lone figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, hands in his coat pockets. Even through the fog, she recognized him. Every heartbeat told her it was him. "Henry," she called softly. The figure didn't answer, just turned slightly. A faint smile. Barely there, but enough. Then he stepped away, fading into the mist. Julia stood motionless. Maybe it was only her imagination, a shadow shaped by memory. But somewhere deep inside, she felt it, a heartbeat sinking with her own whispering that he was still out there. The wind shifted. East. She closed her eyes, tears mixing with the rain. "You're still alive," she whispered, not as hope, but as faith. Far out at sea, a small boat slipped through the fog, heading toward the horizon. No one knew who was aboard, only that sometimes love doesn't need to be seen, only believed in. Still moving, across the ocean, through the wind, with every letter that was never sent. Dawn over the Maine coastline looked different that morning. The sky no longer carried the heavy gray of endless storms, but instead glowed with a gentle light, fragile like a thread stretched between two worlds, one of loss and one of return. Julia Palmer stood on the sand dunes, her coat fluttering softly in the sea breeze. Beside her, Jamie was playing with seashells, laughing in that bright, innocent way only a child could. 3 months had passed since that fateful night in New York. 3 months with no messages, no signs, no trace of Henry Sullivan. But longing never disappeared. It simply learned how to breathe with her quietly, persistently, like a second heartbeat. She opened her notebook and began writing the 47th letter. Henry Vitfive stopped asking whether you're still alive, because sometimes faith doesn't need a reason. Every morning I look east where the wind blows, where you once promised that if you lived, you'd send a sign. And today, the wind has changed. Julia set her pen down and smiled faintly. On the table, the old golden key still gleamed softly under the early morning light. By noon, the small coastal town had grown unusually busy. A ship had docked in the harbor. People whispered that it belonged to a quiet, thin sailor, tall, reserved, asking for only one thing: the old wooden house by the eastern cliffs. Julia's heart skipped a beat when she heard. Part of her wanted to run straight there. Another part feared that if it wasn't real, her last hope would shatter completely. But when the sun began to set, she found herself walking toward the shore. The wind rose, waves crashed hard against the rocks. And there, framed by the crimson light of sunset, stood a man, tall, broad-shouldered. His long coat faded from salt and time. Julia stopped, her breath catching in her throat. "Henry." The man turned. The wind lifted his hair, and in that single moment she knew. No proof was needed. No words. Only his eyes, the same eyes that had once terrified her, yet always made her feel safe. "I can't believe it," Julia whispered, tears spilling before she even realized. Henry smiled, tired, worn, but still carrying that quiet gentleness that stitched every broken piece of her heart back together. "I told you I'd come back," he said softly. "But how?" "It doesn't matter anymore," he interrupted gently. "What matters is that you're still here." Julia stepped closer, her trembling fingers brushing his face. The old scar on his cheek, the sunburnt skin, the eyes that hadn't changed since that night in the Chicago cafe. "You vanished for 3 months. Do you know what I thought?" "I know," he said, voice low. "I was dead, at least to the world. But maybe that's what it took, to be alive again." They fell silent. Only the sound of the sea remained the rhythm of the waves. The whisper of the wind, the steady mingled breaths of two people standing closer than time itself. "Vincent." Julia finally asked. "He's gone," Henry replied. "It's over. No one will ever find us now." "Us," she repeated, her voice trembling. Henry smiled. "If you'll still have me." A single tear slid down her cheek. He reached up, wiped it away with his thumb, so gently it almost hurt. "I used to hate you, Henry," Julia said quietly, "for dragging me into your world, for turning my life into a storm. But now I know some storms only exist to bring us to the right shore." Henry looked at her for a long time before speaking. "I can't promise to make your life easier," he said, "but I promise. I'll stay." She smiled, and for the first time in months, it didn't tremble. Julia wrapped her arms around him, not like someone clinging to a memory, but like someone finally coming home. The wind carried the scent of salt and tears. But in that fragile moment, she knew every fear, every wound, every hour spent waiting had been worth it. That night, Henry lit a fire on the porch. Jamie ran around the yard laughing as Henry showed him seashells that glowed under the firelight. Julia stood in the doorway, watching them, 2 figures, one large and one small, their shadows merging into one under the warm glow. She thought perhaps God still had mercy after all. Because in a world this vast for two lost souls to find each other again, that could never be mere coincidence. Later, when Jamie had fallen asleep, Julia stepped outside. Henry sat by the fire, the light flickering across his face, half in shadow, half in peace. "What will you do now?" she asked softly. "Start over," he said. "Here, with you. No more Sullivan, no more Vincent, no more blood." She smiled faintly. "A normal Henry, if you'll let me try." Her eyes sparkled with the rare glint of playfulness. "Do you even know how to be normal?" "No," he admitted, taking her hand. "But I know how to learn if someone teaches me." They sat together watching the first light appear over the horizon. The dawn spilled warmth across the waves, tender, forgiving, new. Henry turned to her and whispered, "Do you know why I survived?" Julia looked at him, waiting. "Because I still had one promise left to keep," he said. "That when the wind turned east, I'd come back." She laughed softly through her tears and tightened her grip on his hand. And now the wind has changed. Years later, the townsfolk still spoke of a quiet couple living in an old house by the cliffs. The tall, silent man who watched the sea every morning, and the gentle woman who wrote letters and sent them out on the tide, though no one knew to whom. They said that on windy evenings, music could be heard from that house, a piano playing above the sound of the waves. Melancholy, beautiful, eternal. No one knew how their story began, only that it ended there where the dawn returned, and two souls found each other after a lifetime of running. Henry Sullivan, once a name that made a city tremble, was now just a man who held his wife's hand at sunrise and taught his son to fly kites on the sand. Julia Palmer, once the woman pulled into darkness, now smiled when she saw light reflected in the eyes of the man she once feared she could never truly love. And between them there was peace. Not perfect, not forever, but enough. Sometimes love isn't about escaping the darkness. It's about finding someone willing to walk through it with you. If this story touched your heart, follow the channel and share your thoughts below. Every comment is a spark that helps future stories come alive and reach more hearts.